Under the Vegas lights, everything shimmered like a fevered dream. The stage, the sequins, even the air itself seemed electric. The crowd had been roaring for almost an hour straight, but when Elvis stepped to the mic that night, something about him felt different, slower, quieter, heavier. It was July 1973, one of his sold-out shows at the Hilton. Fans filled every inch of the room, some dressed like him, some crying before he even sang a note. Flashbulbs popped like stars, trying to compete with the spotlight that followed him wherever he went. He smiled, that famous half-smile that made the whole world lean in, and the orchestra eased into the opening of Can't Help Falling in Love. It was the song that had followed him through every version of himself. The boy from Tupelo, the soldier, the movie star, the man trying to hold onto something real. He sang it 1,000 times before, but that night something fragile hung between the notes. Wise men say, his voice, warm and worn, rolled through the speakers like velvet on stone. The crowd swayed, mouthing every word. Only fools rush in. The spotlight flickered as if it too was holding its breath. Then halfway through the next line, but I can't help, he stopped. No warning, no falter, just silence. The band froze mid-chord, glancing at one another. The drummer's sticks hovered in the air. Even the audience, that sea of endless noise, went still. You could feel the hush ripple outward like a wave, thousands of people realizing at the same second that something was off. Elvis wasn't moving. His hand clutched the microphone. His eyes were locked on something in the distance, somewhere beyond the blinding lights. For a moment, nobody could tell if he'd forgotten the words or if something had gone wrong. Then someone near the front gasped. Because there, seated only a few rows from the stage, was Priscilla Presley. It had been months since the divorce, months since the papers were signed and their lives had officially gone separate ways. The tabloids called it tragic, but the truth ran deeper than ink could reach. They had shared a life the public could never understand, part fairytale, part quiet heartbreak. And now here she was, sitting still in that vast ocean of faces, her eyes fixed on the man who once held her world together. Elvis saw her, and in that instant, every note, every breath, every wall he'd built to keep himself performing instead of feeling, crumbled. He stepped back from the mic. The crowd waited for him to continue. He didn't. His jaw tightened. The hand that held the microphone trembled slightly, as if unsure whether to hold on or let go. From where he stood, her face was half lit by the stage glow. There was no smile, no wave, just a quiet look of recognition, the kind that carries 1,000 unsaid things. Memories flickered behind his eyes, her laughter echoing through Graceland's hallways, her perfume on his jacket before the flights to Hollywood, the way she'd whisper, "Be careful," before he walked on stage. And now she was back, sitting close enough for him to see that same look she used to give him before every show. The look that meant, "I see the man beneath the legend." The audience began to murmur. Some thought he was ill. Others whispered that maybe he'd seen someone collapse. No one dared to speak too loudly. Every camera flash felt intrusive, like breaking into a private moment that wasn't meant for anyone else. Elvis took a deep breath, but the sound caught in his throat. For the first time in his career, words failed him. He'd spent years mastering control of his voice, of his image, of the myth that kept him on stage long after his soul had grown tired. But one glimpse of her and control meant nothing. The world disappeared until it was just the two of them. The man who lost himself to fame and the woman who once tried to save him from it. A few of the band members exchanged nervous looks. The conductor lifted his hand slightly, unsure whether to start again, but Elvis didn't move. He wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was staring straight through the past. Something like pain flickered across his face, quick, fragile, unmistakable. The audience could feel it even if they didn't know what it was. Because pain like that doesn't need words. It hums in the air, in the stillness, in the sound of thousands of hearts beating together and waiting for the next note that doesn't come. Seconds passed like minutes. Someone near the back shouted, "We love you, Elvis." It was meant to break the tension, but it only deepened it. He smiled faintly, that old polite smile, and whispered something into the mic the speakers barely caught. Thank you very much." It wasn't the usual showman's drawl, it sounded like surrender. Then slowly he turned away from the audience, his back to the spotlight. He lowered the microphone and rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. The orchestra held the chord, unsure if the silence was part of the act, but everyone in that room could feel it. This wasn't part of the act. Somewhere deep in his chest, that old ache began to rise again, the same one he felt in the quiet hours of Graceland, when the music faded and all that was left was the echo of what used to be. He thought he'd buried that ache long ago, under layers of applause and sequins and promises he never kept. But love, the kind that changes you, doesn't die, it waits. And tonight it was waiting in the front row. He tried to look away but couldn't. Every instinct that once helped him survive the spotlight, every ounce of discipline that told him to smile through anything, broke like glass. People whispered, "What's wrong?" A woman clutched her husband's arm. A security guard shifted nervously near the stage. Even the lighting tech paused, finger on the switch, unsure what to do. Elvis's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then finally, he let the microphone fall to his side and said something off mic. The band couldn't hear it. The front row barely could, but those close enough swore later they heard him say her name. Zilla. Just that one word, a whisper carried by memory. She didn't move, didn't smile, but her eyes softened. It was enough. And for a single heartbeat, the noise, the fame, the years, the pain, everything disappeared. The king of rock and roll was gone. All that remained was a man standing before the only woman who had ever known who he really was. He took another breath, tried to start the next verse. The first note cracked, he stopped again. Someone in the audience began to clap, thinking he needed encouragement, but the sound only made the moment feel lonelier. Because you can't clap a man back together. He stepped back, eyes still fixed on her, and smiled, small, sad, the kind of smile that says I'm sorry without words. The band finally let the music die out. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. There's something about silence that can tell the truth better than words ever could. The crowd didn't know what they were witnessing, but they knew it mattered. They could feel the tension, the love, the grief, all tangled together in that fragile quiet. Somewhere in the balcony, a woman began to cry. Others joined her without knowing why. Maybe they saw what Elvis saw, the ghost of what might have been. The spotlight caught the shimmer of sweat on his face. His hair clung to his forehead, but his eyes looked young again, almost boyish. Like the 19-year-old from Tupelo who used to dream about a love that could outlast fame. He whispered something else then, only the first few rows heard it. Don't go yet. Maybe it was meant for her, maybe for the music, maybe for the part of himself he could feel slipping away. Priscilla didn't go, she stayed seated, hands folded in her lap, tears catching the light. He took one more look at her before glancing toward the band. The drummer raised an eyebrow. Elvis nodded slightly. It was the smallest signal, but it meant everything. The orchestra came back in, softly this time. Elvis turned to the microphone again, voice low, almost broken. Shall I stay? The crowd erupted, relief, joy, awe all at once. But underneath that applause, you could hear something else in his voice now. It wasn't showmanship, it was surrender. Every note trembled, every lyric carried a lifetime. He sang like a man who knew this wasn't just another concert, it was confession disguised as melody. As he reached the chorus again, he looked out at her one last time. The pain in his eyes melted into something gentler, acceptance maybe, forgiveness, a silent thank you for showing up when he didn't deserve it. She smiled then, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to undo him completely. His voice cracked again and he let it. For once, he didn't chase perfection, he just sang the truth. The audience swayed, unaware they were witnessing history. They thought it was just another romantic moment, another night with the king. But anyone who really watched, anyone who saw that stillness between two people who once shared everything, knew better. Because that wasn't the voice of a performer. That was the voice of a man realizing that some songs aren't meant to be sung forever. They're meant to be felt once and remembered always. When the final note hung in the air, he didn't move, didn't bow, didn't flash that charming grin. He just stood there staring into the crowd as the lights dimmed. Somewhere in that endless silence, Priscilla wiped her tears and whispered, I never stopped believing in you. He didn't hear it, but maybe he didn't need to. The applause broke out seconds later, loud enough to shake the walls. Yet even through the noise, the stillness stayed, the kind that tells you something sacred just passed through the room. Elvis turned from the mic, nodded to the band, and walked off stage without a word. The crowd screamed for an encore. He didn't come back. Backstage, they said he sat in the dressing room for nearly 10 minutes before anyone dared to knock. When his manager finally did, Elvis just said, "Don't book that song tomorrow." No one asked why. But the truth was simple. That night in front of thousands, Elvis Presley had stopped being a performer for the first time in years. For one brief, impossible moment, he had been just a man, looking at the woman who once made him believe love was worth losing everything for. And the world, for the first time, saw it too. The king had stopped mid-song, but maybe, just maybe, that silence was the real music after all. It's easy to look at that moment on stage and see only the silence, the way the music stopped, the way his voice cracked, but the truth behind it had been building for years. Long before the lights of Las Vegas, before the rhinestones and the exhaustion, there was a house in Memphis where love once felt simple. Graceland wasn't always a museum. In the beginning, it was home. In those early days, you could find Elvis at the piano in the middle of the night, barefoot, still in his stage clothes, humming gospel songs under his breath while the rest of the house slept. The sound would drift down the hall like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. Sometimes Priscilla would wake up to it, stand quietly by the door and watch him. There was something about those nights. When fame felt far away and he wasn't the king, just a man trying to hold on to something holy, that made her fall in love all over again. He'd notice her there sometimes, that soft smile in the doorway, and say, "Did I wake you, baby?" She'd shake her head, though he always did. Then she'd sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, and he'd play another hymn, "Peace in the Valley" or "You'll Never Walk Alone." Back then, he didn't sing for the crowd. He sang for her, for himself, for the quiet. But the quiet never lasted long. The world had plans for him, and peace was not part of them. Every year the shows got bigger, the expectations heavier, the noise louder. He learned to live in the spotlight like it was oxygen. And slowly, the man who once sang for the love of it started singing just to survive it. Priscilla saw it happening before he did. She saw how his eyes changed after every tour, how the sparkle turned dull, how the phone never stopped ringing, how he'd stare at his reflection as if he didn't recognize it. The world saw power, she saw pain. There was one night in particular she never forgot. It was sometime in 1970 after a show in Houston. He came back to the hotel room still wearing his jumpsuit, his hair damp, hands shaking. She tried to talk to him, but he just sat down and stared at the floor. When she touched his shoulder, he whispered, "I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore." It wasn't the kind of thing a man like Elvis was supposed to say. He was supposed to be larger than life, untouchable. But in that moment, he wasn't any of that. He was just tired. She told him, "Be the man who sings to me at home." He smiled, small and sad. "That man doesn't sell tickets, honey." And that was the truth he couldn't escape. The world didn't want Elvis the man, it wanted Elvis the miracle. And the bigger that miracle became, the less room there was for the woman who loved him. Still, she tried. She followed him from city to city, from the laughter of movie sets to the loneliness of hotel rooms. She tried to make the road feel like home, but every city blurred into the next, every applause echoed like a demand he could never satisfy. Somewhere along the way, love started to feel like another performance he had to keep alive. He'd send her flowers when he couldn't call, and promises when he couldn't show up. But even promises start to sound hollow when they're always spoken over the phone. She began writing him letters. Not long, not dramatic, just pieces of her heart on paper. "I miss you, take care of yourself, come home soon." Sometimes he'd write back, but most of the time the letters stayed unanswered, buried under contracts and fan mail. She once said that being married to Elvis was like loving a ghost. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And yet when he was home, he could be the gentlest man alive. He'd leave little notes around the house. "You're my reason for singing. Don't let me forget who I am." Those moments were real. That love was real. But fame has a way of swallowing even the purest things. By 1972, the strain had turned into silence. She could feel him slipping away, not in anger but in absence. Nights grew longer, conversations shorter. He started canceling dinners, sleeping at odd hours, disappearing into rooms where the curtains stayed closed. When she'd ask what was wrong, he'd smile and say, "Nothing, baby, I'm just thinking." But she knew what that meant. It meant the pills, the pressure, the loneliness he could never quite confess. He wanted to be everything for everyone: hero, son, father, husband, savior. And in trying to be all of that, he forgot how to just be Elvis. She tried to pull him back. Once she begged him to take a break, to leave the stage for a while, just the two of them. He looked at her like she'd spoken another language. "If I stop," he said quietly, "I don't know if I'll know how to start again." So he didn't stop. He went back to Vegas, back to the lights, back to the audience that worshipped him. And little by little, she stopped asking him to come home, because she realized he already lived somewhere she couldn't follow, inside the applause, inside the image, inside the myth. The divorce papers came not with a fight, but with a sigh. No shouting, no accusations. Just two people who loved each other too much to keep pretending they could survive the weight of that life. She told him, "You'll always have me as a friend." He nodded, but his eyes said something else, something that sounded like, "Please don't go." When the papers were signed, he went back to the stage the same night. People said he performed like nothing had happened. But those who really listened knew better. His voice broke twice that evening, both times during love songs. That was the man who walked onto the stage in 1973. A man who had everything the world could offer but still felt empty where it mattered most. And maybe that's why she came that night. Maybe Priscilla needed to see for herself that he was still human under all that glitter. Maybe she wanted to remind him that once, before the fame, before the chaos, there was something simple between them. Two souls trying to find peace in a world that refused to let them be ordinary. Some say she came because of the note he sent the night before. A short letter, handwritten in blue ink, delivered by a mutual friend. It said, "I'll be singing the one we used to dance to. If you ever loved me, just listen." Others believe she came on impulse, hearing he was performing nearby and feeling something pull her there. Whatever the truth, when she walked into that casino showroom, she wasn't there for spectacle. She was there for closure, or maybe for forgiveness. Because even though the world called her his ex-wife, she still carried him like a scar she couldn't hide. And when he saw her sitting there, all the years, all the mistakes, all the things left unsaid rushed back in a single heartbeat. He used to tell her that music was his confession, that when he couldn't speak, he sang. But in those final years, the songs stopped healing him. They became mirrors that showed him everything he'd lost. When he sang Always on My Mind, he wasn't performing. He was apologizing. When he sang You Gave Me a Mountain, he wasn't acting. He was begging for understanding. The crowd cheered, but the woman who once knew his heart heard something different. She heard the man who used to sit at the piano in the dark, searching for God and finding only himself. Fame had built him into an idol, but idols can't cry. And when you can't cry, the heart finds other ways to break. That's what people didn't see that night in Las Vegas. They saw the king stopping mid-song. But what they didn't see were the years leading to that silence, the love turned memory, the promises turned ache. Elvis had always been drawn to opposites. He loved gospel because it made him feel pure, and he loved rock because it made him feel alive. He loved the stage because it gave him power, and he loved solitude because it gave him peace. But he could never keep both. And Priscilla, she was the bridge between those worlds. She saw the boy from Tupelo and the legend from Vegas and loved both, even when they tore each other apart. After their separation, she once said in an interview, "There were two Elvises, the one the world knew and the one only I saw. And sometimes I think he didn't know which one he wanted to be." That's the man who froze mid-song, the man still trying to choose between the life he created and the life he'd lost. When she looked at him from the audience that night, she didn't see the king. She saw the husband who used to leave notes by the piano, the man who once whispered, "Don't forget me when I'm not on stage." And he didn't see a fan. He saw the person who knew his heart long before the world claimed it. Maybe that's why he stopped singing, because in that single moment the illusion shattered. He wasn't performing anymore. He was remembering. Remembering the morning she stood at the gate of Graceland with a suitcase in her hand, trying not to cry as he watched from the window. Remembering the night he promised he'd get better. Remembering the way she once said, "All I ever wanted was you, not the world." And for the first time in years, he felt it again. The weight of everything he'd sacrificed to be what the world demanded. The lights, the fame, the applause, all of it felt small compared to the woman sitting quietly in the front row. He had chased immortality and lost the only person who ever made him feel human. And maybe that's what broke him mid-song. Because sometimes love doesn't end with shouting or betrayal. Sometimes it ends in silence, in the space between words you never said. That's what the crowd witnessed without understanding. They saw a performer pause, but what really happened was a man remembering the cost of his own legend. After that night, he told a friend, "I saw her out there and it felt like seeing my own ghost." The friend asked what he meant. Elvis just said, "She was my peace, man, and I let peace walk away." Those who loved him knew that peace was what he'd been chasing all along, through gospel hymns, through prayer, through the long nights alone at Graceland. When he stopped mid-song, it wasn't because he forgot the lyrics. It was because he remembered the truth, that no matter how high fame took him, love was the only thing that ever made him real. And maybe deep down, that's what Priscilla came to hear. Not the music, not the performance, but the truth inside the silence. Because when he looked at her and the band faltered and the room went still, she finally saw the man she fell in love with, the man beneath the crown. The man who once told her, "If I ever stop singing, it'll be because you walked in." And that's exactly what happened. The audience thought it was a strange glitch in the show. But for the two of them, it was the closing of a circle. Years of love, pain, and distance coming together in a single breath neither of them could hold. It wasn't just a pause, it was confession. And when the music started again, when his voice trembled and he finished the song, everyone else heard melody. But she heard something far deeper, an apology she'd waited years to receive. That night, she didn't go backstage. She didn't speak to him. She just left quietly after the encore, stepping back into the life they'd both built without each other. But the silence he left on that stage never really ended. It stayed, echoing in the hearts of everyone who was there and in the one woman who understood what it truly meant. Because love like that doesn't die, it just waits for one last song. The orchestra waited for his cue, but Elvis didn't move right away. He stood there, breathing through the quiet, staring out into a sea of faces that suddenly felt very far away. The world expected another flawless show. They didn't know they were about to witness a man tearing open his own heart in front of them. When he finally lifted the microphone, his hand shook slightly. The band started again, softly, cautiously, as if they were afraid to disturb whatever fragile thing had just broken loose inside him. The opening notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love" returned, but now they sounded slower, sadder, almost sacred. He didn't look at the crowd this time, his eyes went back to her. Wise men say. His voice trembled, the words came out smaller than usual, stripped of their polish. There was no performance in it now, no grand sweep of charisma, it was raw, aching human. Only fools rush in. A hush fell over the room again, heavier than before. Some thought he was acting, others knew better. For a man who had spent his life commanding the stage, it was strange to see him so still. But maybe this was what he'd been chasing all along, not applause, not perfection, but truth. He swallowed hard before the next line, his eyes never leaving hers. But I can't help. The note cracked just a little, but enough for the whole world to feel it. For years he had been trained to hide imperfection. Every song rehearsed, every move practiced, every word filtered through the expectations of millions. But that crack wasn't weakness, it was confession. Because love, when it's real, doesn't stay polished, it bruises, it breaks, and it still sings anyway. She could see it in his face, the way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders softened. The man she once knew was still in there, somewhere beneath the layers of exhaustion and fame. And as he sang, it was like he was trying to reach her through the years that had separated them. Take my hand. The crowd began to sway again, unaware of the invisible thread tying the two of them together. To them, it was romance. To him, it was remembrance. He sang slower now, dragging out each note like it hurt to let it go. Take my whole life too. It wasn't a lyric anymore, it was a surrender. The orchestra grew quiet, as if the musicians understood that this wasn't just a song anymore. It was a man saying goodbye to something he couldn't hold on to, even if he tried. He looked down at the floor for a moment, then back up at her as if to make sure she was still there. She was, sitting perfectly still, hands clasped in her lap, eyes glistening. And for a few seconds, the noise of the world fell away. There were no reporters, no lights, no rumors, just two people who once loved each other so deeply that even silence between them felt sacred. He had sung those same words thousands of times, but that night they sounded like a prayer. Some people say love dies when it ends. But maybe the truth is love just changes its form, turning from passion into memory, from touch into ache, from words into music. And right there on that stage, Elvis Presley was living proof of it. He sang the last lines slower, softer, almost as if he didn't want to reach the end. For I can't help. He closed his eyes. Falling in love. The note lingered, shook, then finally broke apart. With you. He held the microphone away, but the sound kept echoing. The audience erupted in applause, a roar that filled the room like thunder. But for him, it wasn't noise, it was distance. Because when a crowd cheers that loud, you realize just how alone you are. He nodded faintly, forcing a smile, but his eyes stayed glassy. Somewhere deep inside, that smile hurt. The conductor signaled the ending, but Elvis didn't step back. He just stood there, staring into the lights until they blurred. After a moment, he said quietly into the mic, "Thank you." The crowd cheered louder, they thought the moment was over, but it was. Because as the orchestra began the next number, he waved them off. "Hold it," he said, "hold it a minute." The room froze. He looked down, wiped the sweat from his brow, then leaned closer to the mic. "I want to tell you something," he began. His voice shook not from fear, but from everything he'd been holding in. "There are songs that belong to the world, and then there are songs that belong to one person." He didn't say her name, but everyone knew. He glanced toward the front row where Priscilla sat motionless. "Sometimes," he continued, "a song says everything you never could." A murmur rippled through the crowd. He smiled softly. "That's all right, I just wanted her to hear it one more time." He set the mic back on its stand. The band picked up again, playing a slow instrumental refrain. The crowd was silent now, afraid to break whatever spell they were under. He closed his eyes and whispered something the mic didn't catch. But a man in the front row swore later he heard the words, "Thank you for coming." Maybe it was for her, maybe for God, maybe both. For the rest of the show, he barely spoke between songs. Every ballad carried the same aching undercurrent, as if every lyric was a piece of something he couldn't quite say out loud. When he sang "You Gave Me a Mountain," his voice trembled on the word goodbye. During "What Now My Love," his face went pale. By "Bridge Over Troubled Water," the crowd was weeping. They thought it was inspiration, but it was heartbreak in disguise. He had spent his life giving people what they wanted, but that night he gave them what he needed to feel human again, to let the world see that the king could still bleed. When the concert ended, he didn't take his usual bow. He simply stepped back from the mic, placed his hand over his chest, and mouthed, "God bless you." Then he turned and walked off stage, leaving the applause behind like a shadow. Backstage, a few of the crew were crying. Even the stage manager who'd seen hundreds of Elvis shows said, "I don't know what that was tonight, but it wasn't a concert." It was closure. And maybe that's why Priscilla stayed in her seat long after everyone else had left. The world saw a performance. She saw a goodbye. Because she knew that man better than anyone. She knew the tremor in his voice wasn't exhaustion. It was truth finally breaking free. Later, one of the backup singers said she saw Elvis backstage with his head in his hands, whispering, "I couldn't hold it back anymore." They asked what he meant. He didn't answer. That night, he told his band something he'd never said before. "That song's done for me," he said. "I won't ever sing it the same way again." When one of them asked why, he smiled faintly, "Because tonight I meant it." And everyone understood. You can fake charm, you can fake perfection, but you can't fake surrender. That's what people felt that night, even if they couldn't name it. The surrender of a man who had finally stopped hiding behind his own legend. Some say the footage of that performance shows him looking straight into the camera at one point, as if speaking to the whole world. But those who were there say his eyes weren't looking at the lens. They were looking at her. And maybe in that gaze was everything he'd been trying to say for years. "I'm sorry, I remember, I still love you." The strange thing about love is that it doesn't need to be returned to be real. It just needs to be released. And that's what he did on that stage. He let it go. He gave it to the crowd, to her, to the universe, to God. Wherever it needed to go, he sent it there. Because deep down, he knew that love isn't about possession. It's about gratitude for what it gave you, even if it broke you in the end. After that night, he talked less about fame and more about grace. Friends said he started reading his Bible more, circling verses about forgiveness and peace. One close friend remembered visiting him at Graceland a few weeks later. Elvis sat at the piano, playing the same song softly to himself. When asked why, he smiled and said, "Because it feels different now, feels lighter." He never said her name, but he didn't have to. Because when you've loved someone that deeply, they live in everything you do, even in the silence between notes. He once told a bandmate, "If love doesn't hurt a little, you probably didn't love deep enough." That was Elvis, always feeling everything too much, too loudly, too completely. And maybe that's why the world loved him back, because he carried the kind of emotion most people are too afraid to show. That night, though, the emotion wasn't for the world. It was for her, for the years they lost, for the dream they built and couldn't keep, for the man he used to be when she still believed in him. When the curtain fell and the last of the crowd trickled out, a janitor sweeping near the stage found a handkerchief on the floor near the mic stand. It was embroidered with her initials. No one knows how it got there. Some say she dropped it when she left, others say he'd kept it with him all along. But maybe that doesn't matter. What matters is that the last thing left on that stage wasn't applause or spotlight. It was something small, personal, real. Like love itself, quiet, unnoticed, but impossible to forget. For the rest of his life, Elvis would carry that night with him. You can hear it in the way he sang afterward. There was a tenderness that wasn't there before, a humility, a man who'd finally learned that the loudest truths often live inside the softest moments. And if you listen to that recording, the live version from Vegas, you can still hear it. The slight pause before he starts, the breath that catches in his throat, the silence between verses that somehow says everything. That's not just a song, that's history disguised as heartbreak. Some fans called it the most romantic thing he ever did, others said it was the saddest, but to those who understood, it was both, because real love is both. The concert ended, but the story didn't. It lived on in whispers, in interviews, in the way Priscilla's voice softened years later whenever she mentioned that performance. She once said, "That was the last time I saw the man I fell in love with." Maybe that's why he sang like that, because somewhere deep down he knew it too. That night the world saw a legend. She saw a man finally telling the truth. And the truth was simple. He had spent his whole life singing about love, but only once had he really meant every word. That night he did. And that's why decades later, when people talk about the moment Elvis stopped mid-song, they don't remember the silence as a mistake. They remember it as the moment the king finally let his crown fall, if only for a heartbeat, to show the world the man underneath. A man still in love, still haunted, still human. And when he looked at her one last time before leaving the stage, he didn't see regret anymore. He saw peace. Because love, when it's real, doesn't need a stage to survive. It just needs to be heard, once honestly, before the music ends. Backstage, the noise of the crowd faded into a distant hum. The hallway behind the curtain felt colder than usual, lined with mirrors that reflected pieces of a man who wasn't sure which version of himself he was supposed to be anymore. Elvis walked slowly, still gripping the microphone he'd forgot to hand off. The gold trim of his jumpsuit caught the faint light from the stage door, but his eyes looked dim, like someone had unplugged the spotlight inside him. He sat down in the dressing room and stared at his hands. They were trembling, not from nerves but from something deeper, the kind of exhaustion that isn't cured by sleep. He could still hear the echo of his own voice in his head, that cracked note lingering like a ghost. It wasn't just a mistake. It was truth breaking through the armor he'd built for years. He ran a towel across his face and whispered under his breath, "I meant it this time." A knock came at the door. He didn't answer. The knock came again, softer, hesitant, then a voice, quiet but unmistakable. "Elvis, it's me." He froze. For a moment he thought maybe his mind was playing tricks. He turned slowly, and there she was, a Priscilla, standing in the doorway like she'd stepped out of one of his memories. Neither of them spoke right away. The air between them felt fragile, as if one wrong word could break it. She looked at him with a softness he hadn't seen in years, the same way she used to when he'd come off stage in the early days, before the fame became a weight neither of them could carry. He tried to smile. "Didn't think you'd come back here," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of the charm he used to hide behind. "I didn't plan to," she replied. "But when you stopped singing, I had to see if you were okay." He laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. "I stopped singing a long time ago. I just didn't realize it until tonight." She took a step closer, her heels barely making a sound on the floor. "That's not true," she said. "I've been listening all these years. You never really stopped. You just forgot who you were singing to." Her words hit him like a confession he didn't expect. He leaned back, letting them sink in. "And who was that?" "Yourself," she said softly, "and maybe God, maybe me too." For a moment, neither of them could look away. Time didn't feel linear anymore, it folded in on itself. The man who once sang in small-town churches, the superstar drowning in his own legend, the broken husband sitting in front of her, they were all the same person now, caught in the same fragile truth. He finally spoke, almost in a whisper. "You know, I thought singing would save me. Every night I'd go out there thinking if I gave enough, maybe I'd earn peace. But peace doesn't come from noise, it comes from silence." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why you stopped tonight, maybe you finally found it." He shook his head. "No, not yet, but when I looked at you out there," he trailed off, his eyes dropped to the floor. "For the first time, I didn't feel like Elvis Presley, I just felt like a man who used to matter to someone." Her eyes glistened, and she moved closer until she was standing beside him. "You still matter," she said. "You always did, you just couldn't see it through the lights." He reached out slowly, hesitantly, as if touching her might make her vanish. His fingers brushed hers, and for a moment it was like being home again, simple, quiet, real. "Scylla," he said, barely audible, "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't be, we both did what we had to do. You chased the world, I chased what was left of us." He sighed long and heavy. "And did you find it?" "Maybe," she said. "Tonight, for the first time, I think I did." He smiled at that, but it was a tired smile. The kind that knows there's no fixing the past, only forgiving it. "I used to pray you'd come to a show," he admitted. "Not because I wanted you to see the king, I just wanted you to see I was still trying." "I saw," she said quietly, "and I think the crowd saw it too." He looked up, his voice cracking. "I didn't sing that song for them." "I know," she whispered. Silence settled again, not the awkward kind, but the kind that feels like healing. They didn't need to say much. Everything between them had already been said, just not out loud. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled something out, a folded letter, creased from being opened too many times. She set it on the table beside him. "You wrote this to me years ago," she said. "I kept it. I think maybe you should read it again." He looked down at it but didn't open it. "I remember," he said. "I told you I'd always love you no matter what happened." She nodded. "You did, and I believed you." He took a deep breath, feeling his chest tighten. "You know what's funny?" he said after a long pause. "That night I thought I was writing a goodbye, turns out it was a promise." She tilted her head slightly. "A promise for what?" "For this," he said, "for seeing each other one last time without the noise." Her eyes softened. "Then keep it that way." He nodded, and for the first time in years he looked peaceful. A stagehand peeked into the room, asking if he wanted the car brought around. Elvis waved him off. In a minute, the door closed again. Priscilla stepped back, her eyes tracing the man who had once seemed untouchable, now sitting quietly like he was finally learning how to be still. "You know," she said softly, "that's the man I fell in love with, the one sitting here right now." He smiled faintly. "I just forgot for a while." She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle. "Then don't forget again." He leaned into her touch just for a moment before she pulled her hand away. When she turned to leave, he stood, Scylla. She looked back. Thank you, he said, for coming, for reminding me who I was. Her eyes met his one last time. You never really forgot, she said. You just stopped listening. And then she was gone. He stood there staring at the door, feeling the echo of her presence like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. He walked back to the dressing table and finally opened the letter she'd left behind. Inside, in her familiar handwriting, was a line she'd underlined twice. Don't lose yourself trying to be who they want you to be. He closed his eyes and for the first time in years he prayed. Not for fame, not for strength, but for forgiveness. Later that night, long after the crowd had left and the lights were dimmed, a janitor passed by his dressing room. He could hear faint music inside, Elvis at the piano playing Peace in the Valley. His voice was soft, almost whispering. It wasn't the performer's voice anymore. It was the man's, the one who had nothing left to prove. When the song ended, there was silence. Not emptiness, but peace. The kind of peace that comes when you've finally said everything that needed to be said, even without words. The next morning, Priscilla told a friend, he didn't need to say goodbye, that look said everything. And when people later asked her what he was thinking that night, she only smiled and said, he didn't have to say it, I already knew. Because that's how love works at the end, it doesn't need explanations or closure. It just becomes understanding. The years that followed would turn that concert into legend. Fans replayed the footage, searching for clues, dissecting every glance, every pause. They saw a man looking at his ex-wife. But what they didn't see was something quieter, a man finally setting her free, and in doing so, freeing himself. He never spoke publicly about that night, but those closest to him said his voice changed afterward, softer, wiser. The desperation was gone. He sang less like a star and more like a pilgrim who had finally found the road back home. When he sang gospel songs after that, you could hear it, the shift. The weight lifted. The same man who once needed to be loved by millions now seemed content to be loved by one, the God he'd been searching for since the beginning. And maybe that's why that moment mattered so much, because it wasn't just the end of a performance, it was the beginning of redemption. He had been chasing light his entire life, stage lights, headlines, flashbulbs, only to realize that the light he needed was already inside him, waiting for him to stop long enough to notice. That night on stage, when he stopped mid-song, he didn't just pause the music. He paused his entire story. And in that stillness, he found the part of himself he'd lost somewhere between Tupelo and Vegas, between Elvis Presley and the man behind the name. And when he sang those final words, "Take my hand, take my whole life too," it wasn't a love song anymore. It was a prayer. A prayer that was finally answered, not with applause but with peace. Because in the end, that's what every legend hopes for, not immortality, not adoration but peace. And maybe that's what he finally found that night. Peace in the valley, peace in his heart, peace in the silence that followed the song. When Priscilla left that night, she carried it with her, the truth that love doesn't always need to last forever to be eternal. Sometimes it just needs one honest moment to remind you it was real. And maybe that's why decades later people still talk about that performance. Not because it was perfect, but because it was. Because in its cracks and pauses, it showed something no camera could fake, the moment when Elvis stopped being an icon and became human again. And that, more than any gold record or headline, was the real legacy he left behind. Some nights the world remembers you for how loudly you lived, but sometimes it's the silence that defines you. When Elvis stopped mid-song, the crowd thought it was confusion. It was. It was clarity, the kind that only comes when love, regret, and redemption collide in one breath. Because for all the songs he ever sang, that night was the one that mattered most. It wasn't about fame or forgiveness. It was about a man finally seeing himself the way love once did, unguarded, unperfect enough. And maybe that's why decades later people still whisper about it. Because somewhere between the music and the silence, between the king and the man, we all heard the same truth, that real love doesn't fade. It just waits for the courage to speak again. Sometimes the greatest performance isn't sung at all, it's lived.